Hello and good morning! Welcome to yet another revision to the class tier list. So here's the thing. The last few times, when I was going through this thing, the attempt was to try to do the old, standard tier list thing. One unit is better than the other, all of that kind of some suchery. But the thing is, realistically speaking, and this is especially true as of recently going through everything with, a team never bothering to use charms or anything along those lines whatsoever. Generally speaking, we can simply come to the conclusion that every class can beat every other class under the right circumstances. It's simply put, every class can be built in such a way that it'll counter pretty much everything else. It's not a one class will always beat another kind of situation, but they do have a lot of very interesting roles to play, and that's what I wanted to get into here. So, let's go ahead and get into it here. So I've redone the tiers a little bit to be a bit more accurate to what the game actually has to offer here. So let's go through them one by one. So dominant tier are going to be the ones that legitimately stand out from the crowd, the ones that are able to adapt to so many situations so dang well that they do truly stick out above the crowd, above everybody else. Dependable, adaptable, and specialized are going to be the three different flavors of A tier here, where some of them are just pretty much dependable no matter what situation you put them in. They're not necessarily going to dictate the entire fight or dictate how your entire party is going, but realistically they're going to do their job well enough in all situations that they are still awesome to always have on hand. You can safely never take them out of the party. Specialized and adaptable are exactly what they say. Some of them are very particular specialists that'll do one particular job well enough, but they won't have enough glaring weaknesses to be put down into lower categories. Whereas a lot of the just plain adaptable ones are going to be for those units that don't necessarily have a gigantic amount of, push behind them. They don't have some unstoppable amount of defense behind them, but they do adapt to every situation fluidly, while still generally not being something that you would necessarily never take out of the party, so to speak. Fun to use are going to be those ones that just have some fun gimmick that's fun to play around with. Good to have are those ones that you can safely fill in any slot without really losing anything. Situational are going to be the ones that are going to be very situational to put into effect. Difficult to use. I'm kind of trying to imagine anything that would even go down that low. And then there's only one that'll be going down into liability tier, and let's go ahead and get into it here with whatever we have on hand. So, for example, going into the first dependable category are going to be acid dragons, which, yes, I did finally include all of the dragons. I did finally include all of the side classes that were missing from the previous tier list, so we're finally getting that corrected. But acid dragons, essentially, we've got the bulk to march forward and take whatever punching hits are coming their way. They've got enough health and defense to make all that work. They've got boosts to their movement if you need it. They have options to switch into a more dependable role if you need it, into a more defensive role if you need it. They've got scale for that damage reflection. They have the ability to drop their guaranteed breach debuff, which makes them absolutely fantastic for setting up ranged units. Just solid dragon overall, probably one of my favorites in general. Actually, one little thing to get out of the way before we get started. As I mentioned earlier, any unit whatsoever on this list can become an absolute powerhouse. Any unit can become a tank. Any unit can become any number of things with whatever you're throwing at them. I'm basing all of these based off of their standard base version. Like, you just go, you pick one up, and they're good to go in that version kind of situation. Any character on this list is going to be perfectly fine going from start to the end of Code of 4, depending entirely on how you play them. Anything else you throw on top of that is a luxury, so I'm not counting those. Like those situations where, like if you remember from the first tier list, we always had the angry folks that are like, why didn't you put shamans higher? I put 800 charms into them and they one-shot stuff. You could do the same shit with your Faerie, so it's not special to them. Anyway, let's go ahead and carry on here. I just wanted to throw that out there in terms of debuffs are the real power in this game. Debuffs are the fastest way to go from 1 to 10,000. It's by far the way to get anything done. So let's carry on. Next up, in terms of adaptable, we're going to put the archers up there. Their strength is, again, in their adaptability. If, for example, they're actually a dedicated team player. So if, for example, you're running something like those acid dragons there, if you're running like a Terror Knight, which we don't have on the list yet, any kind of defense modifier whatsoever. If they have an elemental advantage on somebody, or if that unit's defense has been breached in any way, their numbers basically just absolutely skyrocket. I love using them from start to finish. They were one of the things that made the speedrun absolutely clean. They were one of those things that still kept functioning into endgame. I always have one on the party. They're just something that's always nice to have on hand, because again, you should be running those debuffs, you should be running those defense breaks, and just seeing them jump up within a couple rounds, going from like they're going to do 1 damage to that guy to like, oh, I guess they're going to do 300 now, and they're up to about 1700. Awesome. It's really fun to see, you know. So either way, they're a really fun unit to play around with, very adaptable. Their finishers are excellent in terms of giving them very reliable debuffs that they can drop in a lot of different situations. Great weapon access, the ability to guarantee debuffs on those weapons. Just, they have a ton of utility in a ton of situations. Love them all the way through the game here. All right, next up, okay, kind of felt bad about, ooh, got a little bit of a weird flicker going on there. Is that coming through on the recording? It is not. That was funky. Hopefully it doesn't show up. Anyway, in terms of Warren, the Astromancer, this is something I'm just going to put into good to have, I guess. It was kind of a joke last time that we put them into the bottom tier there, just because of how difficult it is to get this guy. Realistically, we could still argue that just his whole choice of backup plan as to how he gets recruited is such a massive liability that he almost ends the world in terms of getting himself recruited. You know what? Actually, we're gonna leave him down there for now. From a gameplay perspective, he's absolutely a good to have. He's you know, a good, just solid end game caster. That's, I mean, he just casts things. There's nothing too crazy special about the guy, but I do find it extremely funny that in the process of trying to get himself free, he almost ends the world. So, kind of whoops on that one. Anyway, moving on. All right, next up we got the Berserker. I'm gonna put these under. Okay, they're going to go to dependable. So these are ones that I really vastly underestimated. There's actually several classes that I really vastly underestimated on previous tier lists, just because there's a lot more to be said about their ranged attacks that needs to be brought up. Like Dagger or Fist Berserkers, honestly, they should already be up in everyone's face anyway, but they've got a solid suite of kind of pivots into ranged attacks. They've got great AoEs through their weapons. You can't really silence a finisher. Not to mention they've got 2 ways to boost their just basic neutral offense right from the get-go. They have ways to switch into different elemental weapons for those extra punishes. They've got a lot of ways to spike their damage. Again, access to elemental weapons, access to a wide variety of different finishers, access to be able to both spread and make use of debuffs. Those are the big strengths of any particular unit. Those are massive for just taking pretty much standard damage and throwing it into the thousands. So either way, great units. I mean, hell, if you want to go for just a good little suite to show off the kinds of stuff they can do, I mentioned this last time, but you, for example, put some black powder on them, give them a dragon shield, give them some dragon armor, dragon gloves, give them some flight boots, dragon dagger. And basically have them run Dragon Slayer, Berserk, and Sanguine, as well as that dagger skill there. And now you have a situation where they are already hitting in an area around them. They're boosting their strength tremendously. They're dropping poisons in an area around them while doing a ton of extra damage. They've got a Dragon Slayer that is going to be on par of something coming out of a Dragoon due to the massive amount of bonuses that they're getting off that dagger itself. It's only like a 20% difference, give or take, something like that. On top of the fact that if you've got that black powder on them, if you want to set up turn 1 for a spell strike, you can actually have them functioning as a minimum effectiveness spellcaster, like debuff caster there as well. So if they're targeting tanks from far away, 30% odds of using that poison from that shield to just spread around a bunch of free damage, throw out a few extra thousand before the fight even really properly gets into range. Great stuff. Dagger finishers have 2 great kind of damage spiky options. One that's cheap and hits hard against earth, the other one that's fairly expensive that hits against everything. Can switch into hammers to get some of those gigantic spikes going on there. They've got a one-handed hammer with the same thing against dragons. If you want to go for those big AoEs from your fire finisher, just great options on these guys overall. Solidly dependable. They're not weak enough that they end up getting taken out to overcome all of that offense that they can potentially bring to bear. They get heavy armor options, they get shields, and they can really push a line just by themselves there. Obviously, never leave any of your units unsupported. No unit is an island, but let's go ahead and continue on here. All right, next up we'll say Buccaneer. Buccaneer's pretty good. but I kind of want to put it under dependable, not necessarily dominant. The thing is, they're basically a human hoplite for all intents and purposes, with Speed Star on there. But that's kind of the thing. Something like Stinky Set plus Speed Star, pretty solid. However, a lot of their heavier options are typically going to be fairly slow. If you're running double attack on them, that is doubly slow, so it's more so just overcoming their slowness from that double attack. But again, you know, double attack from Stinky Set can be pretty viable in their hands. Put on something like their Apostate there, they can overcome one of the weird quirks of the Stinky Set, where they're going to be hit by splashes. So they're dependable in that role. Just by themselves, they can have a little bit of trouble, but it's a very solid class. Definitely wouldn't say it's necessarily like the best of the best. They can't adapt to everything. They're primarily strong in terms of kind of like melee and kind of going for those big rushes. Or if you want to just go a little bit more tanky with it. Or even, I guess, like Pistol plus Evade isn't exactly the worst thing in the world. Snub Fusil is pretty redonkulously powerful this time around. But either way, you're not necessarily going to go too far out of their wheelhouse here. Part of the reason that most of the dominant tier this time around is going to be made up of hybrids is primarily due to the kind of big spikes you can get on, like, just depending on the types of attacks that you're using. Like, let's say there's a team with a bunch of squishies, you're going to want to switch into ranged and more physical, or if there's a lot of kind of tankier units, you're probably going to want more magic-orientated, or maybe more elemental bonus-orientated, and being able to switch between all these different styles on the fly is going to make a unit stick out more than everybody else. In their case, they're mostly going to just run up and hit stuff, and potentially evade some stuff. So they're a fun class to use, they're good and dependable. I'm going to leave them over there. They're not really going too much higher than that. Alright, next up we're going to say Cyclops. I'm going to put this one down a little bit into fun to use. They're very... okay. They're tricky, okay? They're tricky to use. They can be very powerful. Howl is insanely good. Hobble is a bit of an unsung hero. Something like Hobble can potentially mean the difference between that big squishy in the back, you know, getting reached or getting not. But that being said, it is a little bit difficult to make use of them. But if you are, for example, spell charging them and stuff like that, they're a great frontline caster to use. I would say if we had another category of a case where we have a unit that's, you know, like really handy to have on hand, really fun to use, but, you know, might be a bit more, I guess, professional level in terms of execution. Either way, they're a fun class to use. Just takes a little bit of tinkering to make them work. Definitely not going down into difficult to use, because while they are tricky to use, they're not necessarily difficult. But something like Black Powder, some debuffs on them, maybe stuff that really doesn't check for stats, like Paradigm Shift or what have you, is generally going to be pretty good for them. Using them as a spell charger, using their physical attacks to then convey that spell charge to somebody else, pretty handy. It again is going to depend entirely on your party. Personally, I like having one with Hobble, with Howl, with Dash, just so they can kind of dash in and drop those debuffs wherever. With Paradigm Shift, some Black Powder, some Paralytic Wave, Poison Cloud, and a spell charge. That way they get their minimum 30% odds, they get their big debuffs that they can throw out in AoEs, and if they end up getting into a big fight and potentially are on their last legs, they can use all of that accumulated MP to go throw onto somebody else to give them a better shot of rescuing their bulky, spiky ass. So there's that. Alright, and actually next will be the Cockatrice in the same camp there. Great debuff when it lands. It's hard to tell how or when, you know, the debuff will end up landing on in their case. Stun Breath is pretty darn viable in their case. However, they're primarily down in fun to use because the Gryphon has to go above them. The Gryphon has to go into frickin' dominant tier. Now, is that fair? God, no, it's not fair. I also almost don't care. Okay, we're going to put the Gryphon down into adaptable. Alright, so here's the deal. The thing with the Gryphon is that they can basically run around with absolute abandon, collecting Fizz cards, collecting Crit cards, and using their insane movement to pretty much get wherever they need to. Now, this is useful for a number of reasons. For one, if you're looking to protect anybody, park the Gryphon nearby, they will immediately draw aggro to everybody nearby, and can then use those cards that they've accumulated helicoptering around the party for most of the fight, to then go and blood siphon anything nearby to heal themselves up. Additionally, due to their insane bulk, anything that is a percentage healing item, like a salve, will heal them for potentially thousands, meaning that one Gryphon can easily take on an entire party in terms of distracting everybody and, you know, keeping your units rescued. Typically, I'll run them with something like one salve, one grog, and 2 blessing stones, just for the ability to go in and rescue 2 units, heal themselves, and get rid of fear if needed. It's kind of a great overall rescue unit. Medical Gryphon is absolutely the epitome of an adaptable unit. It is... they're so good. They're so good. So great overall. That's kind of the main reason that the Cockatrice is down in fun to use, because it does not get that blood siphon thing, and their petrification breath is not necessarily as reliable as, you know, this gigantic aggro situation. They can carry healing items for the same thing, and, you know, petrification is great. I just know that, generally speaking, 9 out of 10 times, I've had a much harder time keeping the chickens running than I have had the Gryphons. I've had... Now that I think about it, I don't think I've ever had a Gryphon casualty, but I've lost 3 of the Cockatrices before. Anyway, so let's go ahead and continue on here. Specialized A tier is going to be the Cleric. And I immediately know that this is going to lead to some angry comments, but it is absolutely a great unit. And bear in mind, I'm using all of this assuming that you're not abusing the money trick. Because if you're abusing the money trick to give, like, every single unit 4 full heals at all times, then, you know, obviously the overall value of this unit would seem dramatically less. But if you are running the standard economy there, you're not running, you know, 10 bajillion item, you know, super expensive items on every unit or what have you, when you're actually playing cost effective and things like that, these guys are great. The trick is to put them in a safe spot where they can safely be 1 movement away from reaching everybody in your party. You give them just their meditation, you give them their blessing, you give them their mercy, and then you give them whatever else you'd like. You stack them up with mind gear, you have them open up the fight by throwing out a charm somewhere in the party. This won't work as well in Palace of the Dead, but even in Palace of the Dead they still had like 15% odds, which did end up causing a huge bit of chaos every time that it ended up landing, which honestly felt more like somewhere in the ballpark of 50% of the time than 15%. But whatever. Typically, I'll keep some black powder on them too, just for those minimum odds. For those Palace of the Dead situations where you want to have a sort of trick up your sleeve to go and kind of throw a chance at a charm at an enemy later on. I know it seems very oddly specific, but the amount of chaos that it can create is very, very beneficial. Anyway, you have them sit on back. You don't use them to heal every round. You don't use them to overheal in tiny situations. Personally, I like running like a heal 2 and a major heal 2, an ease and a resurrection on my main one. The other one is something like a heal 3, you know, boon of swiftness, ease 2, resurrection. The idea is that you want to try to leave them with about 100 MP, and that's when you start throwing out those smaller heals. Because if somebody goes down, they immediately take 1 step forward, bring them right back up for an immediate turn. Clerics are fast. They're one of the faster units in the game. And this means that they can very quickly get that fight right back up into swing. You're not losing any momentum by that unit being downed. Not to mention, oftentimes they'll be in a dangerous position, which means that they can go and immediately attack again. This can be very, very handy, and oftentimes has led to situations where I'm running 2 or maybe even 3 clerics on the team for this particular cheese. And the kind of morale loss that can happen, the loyalty loss that can happen from this kind of stuff, is oftentimes very overstated, because obviously you don't want to be employing the strategy in every single fight. But going through the entirety of Palace of the Dead this way, using a rotating team of units, everybody's still at max loyalty. So you really have to go out of your way for this to necessarily become a problem. Anyway, great unit, fantastic specialist. Where it says that every team should always have a cleric, 100% guarantee on that. Bear in mind that they are also no slouch when it comes to offense. Obviously, when it comes to finishers, they're going to act very differently from weapons themselves. So in the case of something like a Caldia or something like a staff, they are still going to hit incredibly hard in a lot of cases where they're going and applying those finishers. I showed in a video a little while ago how a cudgel finisher can basically one-tap the final boss if set up properly. And this was on a very no-frills kind of team. So this same thing applies to them, that there are those situations where if you apply a breach, you run up your cleric, and you suddenly have a great punish for those kinds of situations, especially something like a Trinity Pulse. Now again, bear in mind that their hammer finishers are also great as a little bit of a supplemental bit of offense, and due to the fact that they're running meditation, as they get later on into the fight, they can keep throw out those big punches, as it were, just keep funneling out those finishers. Really, really undervalued in terms of their offense. Alright, let's continue on here. Next up, in terms of, let's say, specialized... This one's going to be, for specialized, we're just going to go ahead and throw out the Fusilier. Great at what they do. Very fun class to use anyway. Basically can hit those gigantic ranged bonuses pretty much everywhere. Until they get a cursed weapon, they don't have much going in the way of kind of multi-splitting their augments, so to speak. But realistically speaking, when you have guns with like a 40% physical bonus on there, you really don't need much to punch through that. And on top of that, you actually have a very fun thing that you can do, where if you end up making a cursed gun and you give it an anti-dragon bonus, and then combine that with a Dragon Slayer set, you can actually have yourself a ranged Dragoon that can shoot through walls. So, a bit of a fun thing there, because you can get like 30, I think it's like 30% max percentage on that bonus, potentially an elemental bonus. Potentially like 30-40% physical bonus on that same gun, element bonus, what have you, and then Dragon Slayer for that giant multiplier on top of that. And yeah, even without cards, I've seen that going up to 1500s. It's pretty wonderful. Obviously a bit more situational. The Cursed Fusil is a bit of a funky one in the grand scheme of things. I mean, I know since I have been doing that whole kind of low to minimum stats kick recently, the ones that I have are typically running 17-18%, something along those lines. And even still, like, that's where those 1500s were coming from. So, great unit. Great unit overall. A bit slow, that's why they're not going into something like Dominant. But even though they're locked into only physical and ranged kind of stuff, something like their Scatter Shot, especially with a card or two, especially with a crit or two, can pretty much just delete things at long range. They're really, really making up for that speed with raw power. So either way, this generally Fusiliers are, I would say, one of my more kind of preferred endgame units there. Usually we typically only run one because it's fun, but you do you. It's a fun tool in your arsenal all the same. Alright, next up let's see, where do we want to put you? Because you're going to be the, if I recall, the Enfeeble Dragon. Let's see, one of them is Enfeeble, one of them is Spoil Spell. I want to say Enfeeble is the Dark Dragon. We're going to say it's a bit specialized, but still a fantastic unit. Same thing as with all other dragons, just great bulk, great defensive option through Dragon Scale, able to switch between Rampart or Dash depending on whatever the situation calls for. Spoil Spell is pretty solid, or no, are they Enfeeble or Spoil Spell? You know what? They are, in fact, Enfeeble. So anyway, same thing as with the Acid Dragon, except they're setting up for casters. Casters, generally speaking, don't scale as hard. They're just less resisted, give or take. Obviously, there's more nuance to it, but either way, generally, Enfeeble is not going to see as big of a bonus as something like Breach. But still, it can be a good little specialized unit to have up front, especially if you're running a lot of multi-hit casters. It can make a difference. Personally, again, I will still prefer Breach and Longbows, but everyone's going to have their preferences. So great as far as that goes. Anyway, next up we got Dark Priest. Definitely in the dominant tier. Put a sneaky set on them, have them sit in front of a team. Honestly, anything else beyond that is just cherry on top. It's, guaranteed, like, silence, poison, all of that. It just, they just melt. They absolutely melt things around them. It's a bit overpowered and absolutely wonderful. Okay, next up, under Good to Have, we're going to have the Divine Knight. Good to have, because you probably want it for the collection. They take absolutely ages to get a hold of, and, I mean, they're basically, they're kind of a flying knight without a lot of the knight features. So that's nice. They will block things off, so that's handy. They can fly. They've got some access to support Draconics. Again, they're good to have. Every single thing about the class falls into the category of, like, they're good but a little bit difficult to employ. Like, you throw them into the front line, and they do, if I recall correctly, aside from the Knight Swords, they don't have a whole lot in the way of counter options. Like direct counter-attack options, so to speak. I could be mistaken on that, but I recall that they didn't really usually get into fights that often, which meant that they had issues generating MP, which meant that they had difficulty making use of, their songs or the kinds of Draconics that they had on hand. But again, this might have just been my personal situation with them in general. They're a ultra endgame class, arguably the latest game class for any generic type stuff. They're fun. They've got some interesting stuff with their songs and whatnot. I believe some of their songs actually function off agility, which was interesting. Could be completely wrong in that. Again, Divine Knight is just one of those units that's a bit of a mental black hole, because they just never come up. Either way, they're like a Hawkman, but you're locked into just kind of Knight type stuff. So there's that. Hey, so I just wanted to throw in one quick correction here, just one little update as far as Divine Knight goes. Basically, they're going to be functioning a bit differently from any of the other classes. They're one of these cases where it's a unit that's so far back in the backfield that it's honestly not even fair to rate them with the rest of the units, because the whole purpose of the class is functionally a sort of transcendence, so to speak, where basically if you've taken somebody, you've put them through Snapdragon, you've put them through all of this other training, you've basically given them all these crazy relics and whatever else. It's one of these cases where somebody in that condition would be insanely overpowered using it. Like, basically you'd have guaranteed mind control, just like the Faerie has, pretty much a guaranteed undead deletion, just like many of the other kind of like healer classes and stuff like that have. You have a lot of weird tools that nobody else has. It's kind of like it's basically sticking where it is on the list, because it doesn't function like every other unit. You don't necessarily use it because you strategically want to use it, or it's, insanely good in its own way. It's just a really interesting chassis to put a unit that's been through everything else into. Anyway, just wanted to throw those 2 cents in there, and moving on. Okay, so again, if your mileage on Divine Knight is different, please feel free to sound off there. I know personally, it just always felt like this is cool, but I wouldn't go out of my way to get it. But again, could be completely off the mark on that. Admittedly, I just don't really use them. Like, they just constantly write themselves out of memory, which I guess is kind of lore appropriate if you think about it. Anyway, let's go ahead and continue on here. Next up with the Dragoon. This is actually one of the ones that I ended up wanting to redo the list for. It was specifically for many of the ones that I had rated really low last time. I'm going to put Dragoons into fun to use this time around. They're really, really good against beast units. Against dragons, just about anybody can run Dragon Slayer, and they can give them Dragon's Bane. So this isn't necessarily something that's exclusive to them, but their weapon access, as well as their kind of general ability to hit things at a distance, at least a moderate distance anyway, does give them a lot of adaptability in terms of putting them into different locations. Though regularly, I've gone and tested them versus other, kind of base type units here, and typically it resulted in situations where most other solutions ended up sorting out the thing in question before they ever got there. So, for example, the other day I was doing a test of, like, let's say we have a Poison Hydra on one hand, we have a Fusilier with a Dragon Slayer ability on the other hand. Fusilier sorted out that problem before anybody else. We then tried a combination of a Fusilier and then a Swordmaster just kind of running ahead and warping through the wall. Made that whole process even faster with a Breach application. Terror Knight, same thing, except, way faster. They just one-shot the thing. But just by themselves, Fusilier ended up sorting out the job despite having dramatically slower turns. Dragoon was just getting their first attack off and still trying to generate the MP for having Dragon Slayer on hand by the time the Dragon Slayer Fusilier did their job. The Poison Hydra was able to just lock the thing away and slowly poison it to death, but generally kept it out of the fight entirely right from the get-go, so I would arguably put it in second place, just because there wasn't any additional work required. It just kind of blocked it off and sat there, using a combination of Steadfast and Poison Breath to just keep poisoning it as it couldn't get around. So either way, in general, they're fun to use. It's great to see the kinds of numbers you can throw out off them. They've got great weapon access to give them a good kind of like generalist soldier kind of vibe. But in terms of their main specialty, they're usually a bit slower to actually get the job done than many other things. And in some cases, if you don't have something like a Paradigm Shift, or if you are using a Scorpion, lined up right away to actually finish the thing off entirely, you can run into those situations where you're just going to get breathed immediately, especially when it comes to something like Cockatrices. If they end up not one-shotting the Cockatrice, they're immediately getting petrified. It's just the rules of nature. Chicken, better than Dragoon, I'm just saying. But no, I've been using one just specifically to make use of it. I like it. I just wish it was, you know, able to act a little bit faster. I don't know, maybe... Honestly, if there was a mod type situation, I probably would put dash on a Dragoon. But, like, take away their crossbows, give them dash. But that's just me. Anyway, so let's continue on here. Next up, Earth Dragon. I'm going to put it under good to have. Their debuff isn't particularly special. Basically, when it comes to Earth Dragons, Wind Dragons, that kind of thing, here, I think we have Wind Dragon down here. They're all going to fall into this like good to have category. There's certain situations where you want your dragon to simply be there for the purpose of dragon scale and or blocking an area, and having an element that's resistant to whatever the majority element is in that area can potentially be handy. But their debuff isn't exactly anything to write home about, so that's why they're there. Actually, is this the Arc Dragon or is this the Ice Dragon? Where's the other one? Let's see, that's the Tamer, that's the Terranite. Where's the other dragon at? Somewhere. You're a skeleton. And whatever, we'll get to it when we get to... Actually, here we go. Here's the Ice Dragon. That's supposed to go over here. Arc Dragon is going to go right next to the... is that Arc Dragon technically? Whatever. Light Dragon goes right next to Dark Dragon. Simply because their thing is just as potentially useful. It's just a bit specialized. And again, bulky, you know, dependable, all of that kind of thing. They can get in to apply that debuff easier than many other potential units can, and being able to shut down caster units can be very handy, especially if it's something like a Patriarch or whatever else, where they may take a few hits to take out. Anyway, alright, next up on the list, in terms of dominant, fairies. So, just so you know, fairies, gremlins, and pumpkins, I'm just counting as fairies, gremlins, and pumpkins. I know they can do other things, but generally speaking, the familiar is the main thing we're going to be going for. Something like pumpkins being a berserker is freaking awesome, but I'm going to be judging them based off their familiar, and we'll go from there. Because, for example, I think it was, I forget if it was berserker or sanguine that can't stack on top of empower. I forget, there was some weird quirk as far as all that went. But anyway, I'm just going to count them as their familiar version just so we have it there. But Virtuous Dance on its own is disgusting. They have two different ways to practically guarantee mind control. They've got a very wide variety of buffs and debuffs at their disposal. They've got great gear access for the kinds of stuff that they can do. They're quick, they can reset turns, they can reset debuffs. Just solid unit overall. Virtuous Dance is arguably one of the highest damage moves, full stop, simply because you can't count it as just like they will do X amount of damage. In their case, they can control an entire team to turn around, mitigate the damage coming to you, and do it to themselves instead. Like, the math on that is fucky as all hell, and they're just there to mess with the minds of everything. It's fantastic. As far as I'm concerned, like, an absolute game-changer unit. Whenever they show up, they're just insane. Alright, next up. The next up is going to be the Gremlin, and I'm going to put these under dependable. Like, there's no situation that you don't want a Gremlin there. I wouldn't put it quite as insane as Dominant, simply because as good as a Gonal Scream is, it's not an action move. So it is going to take their regular action to throw out there. So it's great for fear and all of them kind of situations, but their ability to instantly reset a turn or potentially drop a massive hit on top of poison is very, very dependable. Again, their accuracy is a little bit iffy sometimes, but they're very, very dependable. Like, I've never regretted bringing them along, and actually the one time that I almost couldn't rescue them, I turned them into a zombie and they just got even better. Arguably, they kind of stopped being able to be instantly revived and kind of ran into this issue where they had to be afraid of necromancers all of a sudden. Anyway. Actually, maybe we'll just put them under adaptable, because they do adapt very well to a lot of situations. If you have somebody that's a big threat that's about to act, they shut down their turn. If they have a unit that's potentially got a lot of bulk to it, they just set them up for accuracy. Like, having a True Strike buff is actually very handy on them. But you go ahead and set them up with their poison attack there. They can easily eat about half of a heavy's health off in some situations. They're just great to have on hand. They won't dictate the fight by themselves, but they are always there, always reliable, always just ready to serve, so to speak. Okay, next up in terms of, let's see, Fire Dragon. Definitely going into dependable. Just, if you have issues where you're getting swarmed by a lot of units, you're getting swarmed by a lot of damage, Fire Dragon, Dragon's Eye, Weaken, damage goes bye-bye. They're very dependable at shutting down physical offense of any kind, whether it be from bosses, whether it be from finishers, random units, beasts, whatever. Anything physical, they will make it go away. They're pretty darn quick about it. Set them up with an MP staff, charge them forward, done deal, problem solved. Alright. Next up, we've got ghosts, and this is ghosts in general. They can be enchantresses, they can be witches, I believe they can be songstresses, but I'm not positive on that. I know that they've got a third class, I don't know what it is off the top of my head right now. I'm going to put them under, I'm going to say situational. They're just like regular casters. They're, they've got their usual regular caster stuff. The thing is, you recruit them pretty darn late, and I could be mistaken on this, but it feels like they have generally less health overall, just due to the fact that they don't have any kind of more bulky options, which just kind of slightly edges them under to the point where they have a tendency to die more quickly. They feel kind of disposable. It's not to say that they can't do the job great. I mean, they still, can be pretty darn good. Getting a hold of them is a little bit of a pain, though, and realistically, you could have just had a basic caster up to that point. They don't have any special movement options available to them outside of hovering. So I wouldn't say they're anything too crazy special to write home about, but either way, they're fun. They're good. It's just a pain in the neck to get hold of one. Skeletons going slightly above them, just more class options. They look funny. You can make calcium jokes all day, so there's that. Golems, I'm going to say fun to use, because you can dedicate their entire skill list into just blocking off an entire area. Actually, I'm going to put them up... I'm going to put them under Specialized. This is another one of those ones that I really, really undervalued last time around. Because we're talking about a unit that's able to physically block off an entire half of the dang map with their bulk alone. Expand force on top of their on top of a rampart, on top of a shadow, everything else. They can just hold off a huge area, just like the Gryphon can, except with they're holding the ground. The Gryphon holds everybody just kind of by distracting them. The Golem physically prevents them from going anywhere. The reason that they're down here in Specialized, rather than necessarily being adaptable, is that while they do have some hitting options, like for example Cruelest Cut is something that you can put in to give them a bit more offense, and a stun debuff, it does give them a bit more adaptability, but they are still kind of limited in terms of their overall offense. A few physical cards will see them keeping up with other frontliners, overall damage-wise, but in general their specialty is just being a physical wall, and they do that well. So definitely A tier, as opposed to, I believe I had them down in D before. In general, their bulk means that they can take caster attacks without getting melted, unless they're being repeatedly hit by crits or something. Gorge and Lock will keep them very safe from absolutely everything. They don't have high enough health, let's say next to something like Dragons and Beasts and whatnot, to necessarily be melted as easily by something like Poison there. And in general, you're not relying on them for offense as much, so all they have to do is sit there. I mean, the fact that you can go and drop off a shadow and just kind of drop it off to the side, giving you a sort of V shape of an area, means that you can effectively drop a 90-degree angle wall facing wherever you'd like, if you just give them an MP boosting item at the very start of the round. This means that in many cases, if you have run into those maps where you get rushed down by ninjas or whatever else, you can make sure that they never get into the fight before your ranged units can finish them off. It's a very, very great unit. I think they're great at that specialty. Let's go ahead and continue on here. Next up, we're going to have the Beast Tamer, easily dominant tier. Same thing as the other ones that are going to be in this list up here, where simply put, they can adapt to everything. Being able to use lobber bombs on top of spamming finishers after using those lobber bombs, on top of being able to completely evade beast and monster attacks, on top of turning them to your side on top of that. Just with a few little skill swaps, they can be an absolute force to keep on hand. Elemental bow plus an axe finisher and stuff like that. Bow plus axe, both of those finisher sets, plus an evade, plus a tame. It's wild how much they can absolutely carry Palace of the Dead for you. And even if you're looking at it from a raw numbers perspective, just 4 lobber bombs with a skills necklace straight into a finisher. that's a level of just raw DPS that outdoes even tier 2 summons. It's beyond busted. And that's assuming those tier 2s even had a chance to roll. In this case, they can consistently do that. Alrighty, let's continue on here. Okay, Hawkmen in general, I know that they have a wide variety of different classes to have, but let's be completely honest here. They are insanely good to just pretty much give any job that you'd give to any one of those classes. It's just great to have free flight on absolutely anybody. So if you are running, warriors, casters, your basic casters, clerics, what have you, Hawkmen clerics, like you might have seen a random Hawkmen cleric showing up on my teams recently named Health Pidgey that's just been doing their job fantastically. They're just great at it, They're basically just regular human units, but they can fly now, and it's very hard to tell them apart, and I'm not sure if that's racist, but let's go ahead and continue on. Yeah, just clearly, it's a wonder how they haven't beaten everybody yet. Similarly, let's go ahead and put Hoplite up to Dependable. Just the ability to tank absolutely frickin' anything is absolutely not so. Same thing for Juggernauts, going up to Dependable. It's just great to have these fantastic automatics on there. Bear in mind, I'm having the standard Lizardman represent the Hoplite. I'm having the Juggernaut represented by the Orc, and I'm having the Patriarch, or rather the Matriarch in this case, represented by the Matriarch, as it were, by the Lamia, rather, just, for the obvious reason of giving them some visual distinction here, since it was a bit hard to tell before. Alright, let me explain the 3 lizard classes real quick. Hoplites, basically physical immunity for 1 tick, 3 ticks of magic immunity, absolutely busted in terms of having weapon access. They can become just an absolute tank that's utterly unstoppable. They can be wherever they want to be. They literally will stop things in their tracks around them. And, yeah, just the hardest tank that there is. In terms of the Juggernaut, able to remove action abilities that have been activated, as well as being able to go and silence and remove MP from units around them. On top of that, they can actually do a pretty solid physical punch if you're going and running a sword, or not sword, but bow and shield on them. So give them an elemental bow, give them a shield, you can see them throwing out some pretty funny punches. But by far, the most dominant of the bunch are going to be the Matriarch and Patriarch, who are going to be 3 ticks of physical immunity, 1 tick of magic immunity, on top of having access to some of the hardest hitting magic access in the game without losing access to debuffs, while still having access to even Dragon Slayer of all things. Like, it's funny that a Dragon Dagger Matriarch running the Dragon Slayer set can hit almost as hard as a Dragoon with that knife. I mentioned this earlier, but it just cracks me up to no end. Anyway, so they can even be your Dragoon. They get the ranged options, they get the hitting options. The only thing that they're really missing out on in terms of like fully min-maxing on hard hitting stuff is nature power, which realistically, like, which would you take? A chance to roll that kind of bonus in damage, or the ability to constantly recharge a shield that will throw away 3 finishers. One of them is just going to be giving you far more value than the other. So yeah, as far as I'm concerned, just the best spellcaster, full stop, no questions asked. Like, good lord, they hit so dang hard, they tank so dang hard, they're ridiculous in terms of the stuff that they can do. Alright, next up, we have the good old dependable Hydra. So I would put it in dependable with these other 2, but these are a bit more of a slow burn kind of situation. Physically, they're not much to write home about. Defensively, they're a bit worse than the other dragon types. On paper, anyway. Their neutral defense is a bit worse, but that being said, their main offense is poison, and they are one of the few units that are able to guarantee an AoE poison. So no matter what the resistance is or whatever else, as long as it's not completely immune, they can guarantee the poison through Dragon's Eye, while also tanking in the meantime, meaning that they are functionally a Viper, not a Hydra. So they can simply trap something somewhere, repeatedly poison it until it dies. They can do this with an entire group. They can, tank the whole entire time. They can even dash their way through if you're looking for more of a back row snaky experience. They're specialized. They're fantastic. They're wonderful. But yeah, they're going to take a little bit of setup. Generally speaking, feed them an MP stick, send them forward, watch some poison fly. It's just a good time. All right. Next utterly dominant unit is the Terror Knight. No questions asked. They are, like, they're going to be slinging around some of the most ridiculous combinations that there are. You've got Concentration coming in to guarantee their debuffs, while their standard debuff odds are, you know, very, very low. Their ability to take those 30% odds and repeatedly spam them while functionally being very close to invisible to many units around them is going to be very handy. The reason that they've got that near invisibility going on there is because they're a very non-tempting target. They've got high defenses, courtesy of their armor, on top of the fact that, generally speaking, they're not going to be physically directly attacking stuff as often, on top of the fact that they're going to be dropping fear on things around them, means that they're usually not very threatened by the stuff that's nearby them, and they can simply hang out on the peripheries in some cases, repeatedly leeching health off of terrified targets. They are just completely nutso. If you give them something like a two-hander, you can go for the old Breach Fear combo, which means that the next, well, anything that hits that unit is just going to make them just utterly explode. And if you want to go a bit more tricky with it, you can always put a cudgel on them, and then go into something like a Fear Trinity Pulse, which, yeah, that's another one of those cases where something just outright explodes. If you can also use them for MP suppression through Leech MP, turn suppression through Paralytic Wave, or just to go for those Hail Mary turn deletions through Sleep and a Cudgel. It gives them a pretty decent amount of range, almost spellcaster levels of range, actually. They're only one tile less, and yeah, just great units. Definitely one of my absolute favorites this time around. They have seen so much of a buff since PSP. And honestly, I would say they're even better than the SNES version. Like, the SNES version, they were pretty darn strong. This time around, they are... oh, they're just beautiful. Alright. Next up, let's see, what do we do with Knights? I feel like you're going to be inadaptable. So, the strength of Knights there is their ability to take a percentage defense and apply it to everything. So just like the Dragons, they're going to have a percentage defense skill, but it's also, with only one skill card, practically can be guaranteed to be turned on all the time, which goes up to 90% defense against absolutely everything. Which means anything aside from poison just has a really hard time actually killing them. Even if they're breached or whatever else. Now, the fun part about this is that they also still have pretty solid offensive options. Shield plus Crossbow gives them good AoEs, as well as a solid Elemental Spike through Brimstone Hail. Gives them a stop effect through Sanctus Flare. They've got Poison from Swords. They've got those same AoEs, as well as some other debuffs through Hammers. Same thing through Axes. They've got a lot of options, and they're very good at holding lines. The thing is, oftentimes they get misused, because folks will just kind of put them at the front of their party and say, here you go, keep the rest of the party safe. And that's what Guardian Force is for as a skill. That'll do the job when it triggers. So if you're using them in that role, just use Guardian Force. Don't bother necessarily putting them in front of the party, just put them in the middle of the party to go and absorb those hits for everybody. But if you really want to see them holding lines, you put on Rampart Aura, you throw them way the hell in front of the party, and just have them function as a delaying action. Just like the Golem, they are there. They're the primary strength of something like a Rampart Aura, and this actually applies to the Dragons as well. The primary strength of something like that is the fact that it can delay units and keep them out of the fight for an extra few rounds. It's not there to say, hey, they absolutely can't get through now. It's no, they are stuck up there, and then you move them back slightly, and it's like, okay, they are now stuck a few tiles forward, and then you move them back slightly and move them back slightly, and this allows for those ranged units, casters, all of that kind of thing to constantly bombard everybody in front. Those kind of slow retreats rather than, simply just putting somebody out there like a wall. All right. Next up, we've got the Lich, which is going to go into, do you want dominant or dependable? I'm going to say dominant. Same reason as the Patriarch, except in their case, they're exchanging the Hyper Armor for two different means of MP regeneration, on top of Reflection just being absolutely hilarious. Not to mention, unlike previous entries, they are far easier to get in Reborn, since you can simply go and recruit them, so there's that. Which, I mean, granted, you could before, but it was just a lot more difficult to do. Anyway, so they're more prevalent now, they're more around. Simply just do something like a Life Force at the start of the round. It's like Meditate into Life Force into a Salvation. and they've just fed MP to the entire party. I like running essentially using them next to a Beast Tamer in order to kind of feed the situation where you've got the caster that's doing the life force into the thing, into the, passing out MP to the entire party, into having, for example, several Cockatrices charged up. They run up they do their petrification while getting empowered in the meantime, while going and getting a charm shot off of that Beast Tamer. Just like they're a really, really synergistic unit. So wonderful for that. Let's go ahead and continue on here. And I would say the Necromancer is actually just under that. I've been using these guys a lot more recently, and I see what folks are talking about. Same kind of situation with applying Life Force, and Life Force into like Resurrect Corpse or whatever the hell it's called. Just generally is a great little comeback move. It basically allows you to create a resurrection loop with additional zombies. So, for example, you do a Cleric into a Resurrection into a Necromancer, who then uses Life Force to then go into a Resurrect for their undead units, who are then carrying another Blessing Stone, who then revive another unit. You can create a potential revive chain for an entire party that way. Not to mention they've got really good odds of landing debuffs in most cases. Most of the Necromancers I ended up using this time around did end up having really solid debuff landing odds, especially with concentration. So just also something potentially very handy. They do miss out on some of the offensive potential of the Lich, but still, very dependable unit. Great for splashes, great for debuffs. So definitely going into dependable. Next up, in terms of Ozma... it's weird here, because I kind of want to put her into, do we put her up here? Like, she's good, but, whatever, we can just put her up there. We're going to put her into Dominant, just so we can make a Dominatrix joke, and move on. Anyway. So, Lord will definitely go into the top of Dominant tier for the obvious reason that they are a custom created class with cheat stats. So, that's going to be wonderful there. Recently, I've been absolutely loving what I call the Time Lord build, which is Exorcism Staff, Dragon Dagger. Get whatever armor you'd prefer on that situation. Hopefully some crit boosting and stuff armor. Go ahead and have them running around with Paradigm Shift, Resurrection 2 on top of Boon of Swiftness, as well as a Heaven Judge. And yeah, it's a situation where they've got the exorcisms, they've got the free turns, they've got the free resurrections, they've got a backup plan for everything. It's just awesome. Anyway, obviously, Conserve MP, Phalanx, all of that kind of some suchery. Just collect some auto cards. They're super common. Easy enough. All right. Next up into Dominant tier. Probably going to be getting close to the end of that tier, actually. Valkyries, for the obvious reason of they have Conserve MP, therefore they can cast, they can drop finishers, they can recruit things. You'll notice there usually won't be anything with a recruit skill on the lower end of the spectrum here, which I actually didn't... Yeah, I did mention that for Beast Tamers. Recruit skills are busted in terms of how powerful they can be, so yes, in terms of the recruit skills, absolutely insane. In their particular case, they can go drop summons on something and immediately recruit right from turn 1. I've had cases where I literally just had them walk right over to a unit, drop a summon on them for a quick damage burst, immediately recruit them, have that unit turn around and attack their allies. It's just wonderful. Like, they can be everything that you need them to be. Alright, next up, in terms of the Ninja, they're going up into Adaptable. This is another one that I rated really low last time. It really does not take much for them to be insanely strong. Actually, recently I've been coming around to the whole idea of the sword and blowgun build. So blowgun's really solid in terms of their debuffs for obvious reasons. Basically you get gigantic stat bonuses on top of those crazy debuffs that they carry. But on top of that, the actual sword finishers are very varied in terms of the stuff they can be useful for. You've got great long range off something like a Dark Blade. You've got a water punish. You've got a light punish on there. A dark punish on there. Which also functions as a good AoE around them. You've also got a backup plan in terms of if their Envenom didn't roll, you've got a poison finisher that's showing up off the blowgun. And Steel Stance can be really good in terms of just running up and sword hitting something. So that's great. I still wouldn't say 2 swords are going to be too great on them, just because they don't necessarily have kind of they suffer from that lack of speed. Granted, if you do pick up enough cards to constantly have steel stance on, two swords can be an absolutely wonderful combination. It does feel like a little bit of a liability, but, you know, it can work. Basically, steel stance doesn't wear off until their next turn, so you don't necessarily feel the punishment from the two swords as much, specifically only if you've rolled steel stance. Otherwise, you have to get the hell out of there. But if you get their spellcasting swords, which there are a lot of later on, and once you're starting to get into the relic era, you're going to see a lot more casting options available to them. So either way, great flexible unit. If you are running two swords, would definitely recommend keeping something like a concentration and Shadowbind on there as well, just to give you a sort of oh crap moment in case they're about to get overwhelmed. But yeah, Steel Stance is a great move against everything except for bosses. A lot of heavier units can break through it just fine, but as they are, you know, they'll do the job just fine. Next up, actually, this is going to be another one that I'm rating far higher than before, and that's going to be the Swordmaster. They're also going into adaptable and not even specialized. Because what folks have been saying from the beginning on the Swordmaster is absolutely accurate. Actually, I would even put them up into dependable. Because when it comes to the Swordmaster, you don't use them to go and directly attack something. Personally, my favorite setup at this point was to give them any kind of casting relic sword later on. Like, I was just running the basic, I think the Nadachi was the one with the anatomy bonus early on. But basically what I was doing was I took a Cleric, converted them to a Swordmaster, and then sent them up to the front to simply just look for any skill cards they could get. They go for their Preempt, they go for their Mind's Eye, and it's basically just free damage. That being said, you'd think that they'd end up getting targeted by ranged units all the time, but this is also why you keep things like Gryphons and whatnot around. So, for example, you can do these situations where you keep a Gryphon a few tiles away from them, ranged units will go and attack that instead. The Swordmaster goes and gets free damage on those frontliners, and then is able to either disable units or buff the ones that you've already got on the field. Interestingly enough, their Harvest Stance is actually boosted by Fairy Scale Powder, so you can get additional healing off of that using the stuff. Anyway, so this basically means that they're getting free damage. Later on, like, what I would consider the epitome of this whole setup is, let's say they're running something like a Sweep Blade, that's a 15% anatomy bonus, you get a Dark bonus, you switch them to a Terror Knight, switch them over to a Dark, switch them back to a Swordmaster, you're now getting a standard, like, Valkyrie level damage off of the summons, off that sword, so you get free summons immediately. You use that to bypass any physical defenses, you use that to build up some MP, at which point you can use your auto skills to then go into the dances, to then apply some breaches, to then support some ranged units. Like, they're just crazy dependable in terms of applying all of this stuff. The reason that the Cleric earlier was relevant is that higher mind score will allow them to remain being very solid in terms of applying those slow and breach debuffs in a huge area. So very dependable for those particular situations. Actually very useful for recruiting as well, because you can just repeatedly slow stuff down while going and applying Boon of Swiftness to your own units. So I've just, again, it was one of those cases where I've just regularly been keeping them on practically every party, just because they've been performing well, even before they ended up picking up relics. So yeah, definitely going up into dependable. Definitely underestimated these guys the first time around. Actually, even stuff like a Falsestrike off their third finisher and the crazy damage spike you get off their final finisher is nutso. It's absolutely wonderful how much that can do. So yeah, absolutely dependable unit in my book these days. Certainly a massive leap from before. Like I said, this is one of the main reasons I was going and redoing the tier list. Had a lot more additional tech for all of these units. But yeah, just very dependable units. If you are running into issues like, for example, Palace of the Dead, where you are going to run into those situations where a lot of your debuffs are less likely to land, same old, same old. Apply some Black Lizard powder, and there you go. Okay, next up in terms of, let's say, Octopus, I would say fun to use. They're great at what they do. They can, they apply long-range breaches, they apply long-range poisons. They're very fun to use. Their lack of guarantees can be a little bit of an iffy thing, but they do have the longest range breach in the game at this point. So this does give them a lot of play in terms of being a overall presence. They've got a good amount of... actually, I would say probably adaptable even. Or do we... I'm just going to put... Okay, I'm going to leave it in fun to use. like, the long-range breach is wonderful, you can't necessarily guarantee it. The long-range poison is awesome when it happens, you can't necessarily guarantee it. You don't necessarily need Aqua Veil, because there's more tiles than you may think that actually count as water tiles. Personally, I ended up putting a Cloud Ring on my favorite octopus just to make them hover above poison tiles so they don't get affected by them anymore. Just kind of, you know, for Palace of the Dead reasons and such. Ended up replacing it with Steadfast so they don't get knocked around. But either way, they're a great kind of long-range breach cannon with a very cheap thing. Like, if you picked up an MP card and a crit card and then just had them sit on a water tile, you've got a great long-range breach cannon. Just absolutely wonderful for setup. But MP regeneration is one of the less common cards to spawn, so there's also that. You can just have them go and attack things to build those things up. They're very fun to use. They're not necessarily in the good to have, but I don't feel like it category. Like, I still regularly will deploy them just kind of for the hell of it. I mean, their bulk alone is enough to give them a lot of value. They're mostly just kind of there, though. But yeah, Breach and Poison, though, absolutely wonderful. So there's that. Let's see. Paladin. It takes a long time to use this guy. Okay, he's a great unit. He comes with all of his weapon skills maxed out, and he's basically a Juggernaut meets a White Knight. Combat-wise, the dude's fantastic, but it takes so freaking long to get him. Like, you easily have to spend hundreds of hours to get a hold of this unit, and by that point, I mean, I know personally I would just prefer to use the Juggernaut that I already have. Like, he's got his short bow, he's got his tower shield. I don't even care that there's better shields. Dude's using his tower shield. They just sit there, they block stuff, they intimidate stuff, they silence stuff. Meanwhile, he's over here like, I have all these better stats, and I don't care to use you. So, either way, so we're just gonna put him under difficult to use. Moving on, Kashua in her basic priest class. We're gonna say situational for basic priest, because, like, you use them just kind of because you feel like it. They're kind of a worse version of the princess, especially because the princess comes with the main reason that you'd switch them to priest back in PSP. So yeah, overall, I think she gets more recovery moves. Like, I think she gets resurrection and stuff like that, but I'll be honest, I haven't really, like, felt the desire to keep them as this class for any particular reason. Mostly because there's already clerics already doing the cleric thing. So in general, if you wanted your basic, magic missiles and things like that on top of cleric abilities, there's that. But then also you got the princess over here who's actually going into, yeah, okay, they're easily one of the best too. We're just gonna put them over here as well. Basically, when it comes to princess, lately I've been really liking this combination of Lucky Star, Whips, Meditation, and the Stinky set. Just because you get Meditation into picking up a crit card, into spamming Armageddon every round, which is just stupid powerful. So there's that. Yeah, Whips, really good on the princess. I have no idea why the princess is into Whips. That's a question for somebody else. All right, next up, in terms of the Pumpkin, definitely super adaptable, just like the Gremlin. They've got a lot of great abilities. Pumpkin Pie may be locked into 65 health for healing, but it is so cheap and so spammable that, surprisingly, it has actually saved units multiple times. It may be a meme move, but dang it, I will still use it in the same reason I will still constantly use Quench back in previous versions. So, yeah, 100% going to be there. You know what, all of this is making me think maybe we should move the basic Hawkman down into adaptable. That feels more appropriate. Okay, we'll keep basic Hawkman down here in adaptable, since it can mean a lot of different things, so we'll leave him there. Okay, advice. The Ranger. Fun to use, but what are you doing here, man? I'm still testing this. I have a theory that there may be some interactions with back attack and parry odds and things like that. I think. Like, jury's still out on that. I can't say that there's anything conclusive that I've come up with in terms of other uses back attack may have. It's very oddly specific. But But he doesn't really have much going for him aside from, like, lobbers and rifles, at which point he's just a faster Fusilier. So, you know, faster Fusilier who can't crit or shoot through walls, or he's a Buccaneer, except he can also be a Buccaneer, and frankly, the Buccaneer is just better. Yeah, I don't know. There's really not much to say about him. He's not bad. He's fun to use, I guess. He's almost like a fun little puzzle box that you're trying to figure out, like, who created you and why. Alright, next up, difficult to use. Rogues, absolute top of difficult to use. Next up, we've got the Shaman. We're going to put this under fun to use, and I know that immediately is going to get some folks pissed off, but look, strategically speaking, let's look at it this way. They do have, like, everything they have, somebody else can do better. And, I don't mean in terms of, like, well, you know, here's piecemeal, every single piece of the, you know, their thing goes to somebody else, and they're the amalgamation of all of them. That's how many will see it. But strategically speaking, anybody can do damage, anybody can do devastating amounts of damage. It's just down to applying the right things for it. Their approach is basically boosting yourself to damage the other guy harder, namely the standard SRPG approach, or just the standard RPG approach. Whereas pretty much everybody else is like, well, I'm just going to break the other guy and get my, like, 80% bonus right away, and these guys are like, well, I might get my 50% bonus sometimes if I can use my slow movement to go pick up some cards, and hopefully I don't die in the meantime. Usually, the thing that ends up coming up around this point is that folks will have these small handful of characters, they've thrown a bunch of charms at them, they've thrown all of the best equipment at them, and then this just kind of mentally snowballs into this effect of, like, this is the best unit, and it's like, yeah, you've given them all of the good stuff and not given that to everybody else. Of course it's going to seem that way by comparison. For the sake of actual comparison, when I've gone and, like, recently, gone and taken basic Shaman, threw him up to the level cap, from the time that they were hired straight into their final class without any additional charms, without anything else, the actual damage difference between, you know, Shaman and basic random generic Valkyrie was about 30, just like it was the third time around. This wasn't a fluke that happened that time. If you throw enough stuff at any long-range unit, they will absolutely dominate. Same is absolutely true for stuff like archers. Yeah. In terms of spellcasters and things like that, they don't have debuffs outside of the Caldia. They don't, for example, get any other kinds of gimmicks like free MP or whatever else, meaning that they are going to spend their first turn setting up. If they're doing tier 2 summons and stuff like that, they're going to burn out pretty quick. If they're running tier 1s, they're going to be a bit more viable in that. They've still got their long range and everything else, but comparing something like a Lich running nature power and all of their abilities next to a Shaman running all of their abilities, honestly, I would just absolutely take that Lich absolutely every single time. They're easier to get. Their side quest doesn't involve, 40 plus maps. Just compared with the two, I will 100% take the Lich every single time. Not even a question. Patriarch or Matriarch definitely above that, and even a basic Valkyrie above that. Strategically, they just don't have much going on. They do one thing, and that's just long-range artillery, and they do that well. They're a very one-note kind of class. If that's what you're looking for, great. They are fun to use. They're great for the, the flashy fireworks. Usually their thing is just you give them a summon, you give them an Apocrypha, you give them a splash of some sort, you give them the longest range gear that they can get, you boost their crit as much as you can, you just kind of pray for the dice to roll in your favor at that point, and then, yeah, you just kind of nuke from afar. That's their whole shtick. It's basic, but it works. I mean, I like the fact that they can read the weather. That's fun. It's great to have a little printout of all of that. I personally think that they could have gone a little bit more in the one vision direction and kind of given them that, maybe like giving them an automatic to change the weather and stuff like that, but whatever. It works. It works. Like I said, I prefer to leave all the sisters as other things. Like, for the sake of comparison, this time around, I took Olivia, I made her the Swordmaster. I took Saria and made her the Shaman. I took Olivia, or not Olivia, but what's her face? Valley Girl-looking situation, Sherry. I made her the Terror Knight, and then I took Sistina and made her a Ninja, and then compared all of them. And overall damage-wise, there's not really that much of a difference. The main difference is in how they're applied, in which Oops. Dropped a random hinge, in which the shaman will be nuking from long range. Valk will be getting in close and using their free casts. Ninja will be using their free casts off of their weapon into finishers, and then Swordmaster will be using free casts off their weapon into finishers. And between the Swordmaster and the shaman, basically, well, hell, between all of them, if they're using their offensive spells and things, it was really not any significant difference. So let's go ahead and carry on. I just feel like I always have to explain it because people always get so mad about that. Like, it's the only one that can do... No, it isn't. Everybody can do damage. Anyway. Songstress is very adaptable. Very, very adaptable. I would say probably dependable. Greatest heal move in the game in an AoE. Greatest ability to restore MP to all of your units. Their finishers are top-notch. A combination of Caldia and Instrument will basically give them practically every element in terms of the stuff that they can do. Just beautiful unit in general. It's not just Yuria that can become it, but Pumpkinheads as well. And I would say like zombie songstresses and things like that are definitely worth pursuing. Just, yeah, solid A+ unit, great and dependable. The only reason I'm not putting them into Dominant is because, just generally speaking, you know, stuff like this here. Because, yeah, they do generally have to rush in a bit more. Which, granted, their finishers are great for that, but, you gotta put the Singer down here. They're more of a support. You don't necessarily expect them to run an entire fight on their own, but I have seen them do it before. Next up, Basic Warriors, going into Adaptable. They are definitely way more adaptable this time around. Reliable dropping of all of their debuffs. So I'll actually go ahead and put them up here because they're a bit earlier. Anyway, great in terms of dropping debuffs. Great in terms of different access on their weapons and things. The fun part about Warriors is you can actually turn them into a reverse wizard of sorts, wherein if you set them up right, you have, like, let's say you give them a glass pumpkin or something like that, you more or less have a wizard that can't be shut down because they're using their extra movement instead of extra casting range to go forward and drop finishers of all kinds of different types. However, all those finishers will be doing extra versus the correct elements, meaning that they are effectively a kind of puzzle piece creator in a way. So early game, they're a fantastic line pusher. Mid game, they're great for guaranteeing debuffs off other weapons, as well as preventing parries and things. So they're very, very good at pushing through the lines in that way. Just making sure that those parries and deflects are not a thing. And then later on, they become basically become an unsilenceable wizard. So there's that. All right. Next up is going to be the Lightning Dragon, definitely going up with the other two dependable dragons in terms of just True Strike being great. Or not True Strike, but False Strike being absolutely great for messing up a lot of heavier units. Usually I send out a combination of all three just to make sure that they're going to be no threat and can be dealt with pretty effectively. Next up, Vartan. Fun to use, but usually I prefer a Beast Tamer with a Vartan setup. I mean, that's really about all there is to say to it. They've got great movement. They've got good access to those different finishers and weapons and such. Their skills are primarily useful for fighting in bad weather and swamps. So kind of a bit oddly specific on that, but their buffs are handy if you are running things like longbows, especially around like Chapter 2 and 3 or so. Like breaches plus instills and longbows, as well as just having a Vartan there, can be a great way to do some very very quick pushes. Mostly their strength lies in their ability to move around to wherever needed, which basically means free card access. So there's that. Alright, next up, Warlock. I'm going to put in Specialized. They are specialized for what they do, but these, again, are something that I generally really underrated last time, because those long-range Draconics and things like that, just sitting put and dropping Draconics, they're far more likely to find their full range of targets than I originally was counting for. Draconics basically have a few tiles of extra range on there. That's why they're a bit more expensive. But yeah, having something like a Draconic Warlock with debuffs more or less meant long-range mind control, long-range debuffs, long-range snipes with Draconics and things. kind of like a lower damage version of the archer in a way. So they're pretty specialized in those particular things. Their later draconic support abilities are pretty interesting in terms of giving somebody nullify and teleports and things like that. But usually just basic splash abilities and debuffs are what I've been liking on them. On top of being able to do empower Golem for fun things like Heaven's Tear plus crit card spamming, so that stuff can be pretty darn fun. Golems do a great job of protecting these guys. They're a great little buddy system that they've got going on there. Definitely vastly underrated them last time. Not to mention they also turn out to have the highest MP growths of anything. So them and Knights are one of those few cases where it's a growth that you actually might want to pay attention to. Higher MP growths particularly matter if you're going and using something like Clerics, where you're going and getting Resurrection, meaning that you're getting 25% MP back, which means that if you have something like Insight or you have a high MP part to begin with, you can be coming back, from the dead, getting an instant turn with 100 MP ready to go. So it's kind of an important thing to pay attention to. Anyway, so HP and MP are the hardest things to actually get up. Knights have the highest HP, I believe, outside of monster units anyway. And Warlocks are going to have the highest MP, from what I understand. Haven't double-checked that. I'm just going to take people's word on that and go ahead and move on from there. Then we've got White Knights going into Dependable, just great speed boost. They won't necessarily carry an entire fight by themselves, but that Paralysis Blade on top of their speed boost means that they're always there, always ready to support everybody else. Usually just having them sitting and, ending turn immediately next to a bunch of ranged units is going to be going to be a great choice for them down the road, just allowing for multiple units to just fire over and over and over and over and over again. It's just a good time. Alright, basic casters going into adaptable, because, lots of debuffs. They're the speed debuff caster, as it were. Conserve RT, combined with Meditate, combined with the cheap cost of debuffs, mean that they can, and combined with concentration, mean that they can poison an entire party faster than anybody else. Very, very dependable at doing that particular thing, which is why they're above the Hydra in this particular case. And then we have the Witcher, which is, if we're being completely honest, it's terrifying that they're even on the party, because they're functionally a war criminal that you had to spend an egregious amount of money to actually go and hire. They're, for all intents and purposes, a shittier version of the princess. So, there's that. They're, okay. The Witcher, fighting-wise, is not bad, but really low health to start off with. As far as their main specialty comes in terms of splashes, their weapon access gives them access to whips, which means that they can do the same thing the Kashua can with the Armageddon spam. But at the same time, that low health does cause that whole getting smacked around by splashes thing to be a bit more annoying if you're doing the stinky set setup. Her magic time ability there is not as impressive as it used to be in back in PSP. For shenanigans reasons, we're just going to leave that over there. In general, she's alright. I feel like she's almost, joke-wise, not necessarily the kind of reward you'd expect to get for how difficult and expensive she is to get a hold of. That's kind of always supposed to be the joke. For those that missed it, by the way, if you're wondering why she's so difficult to get, in every one of these games, she is a hidden character that is just a gold digger. She is there basically collecting money to try and take over the world, more or less. Like back in March of the Black Queen, she's just decapitating random villagers and turning them into pumpkin heads. And then if you say that you'll spare her, you get a massive reputation drop, because they're like, why is this asshole letting her live? She's a body snatcher, by the way. Even if she ends up getting killed off at that point, she always just comes back. So she's just, you get a massive reputation drop, and then you have to go buy a very expensive item several maps from there in order to go and get her on your team, and she's just a basic witch, basically. Just a slightly better basic witch. Which was basically just a paralytic wave spammer back in March of the Black Queen. Then in Night of Lotus, you have to collect several hidden items, sell them to a shop in order to unlock a Pumpkinhead guy, and then from there you have to have you use her to get to that shop. I apologize. in order to get her, you have to recruit a random soldier with her name, switch them to the right name and element, and then basically roll a 4% chance to recruit a unit, to then get Vixen's Whisper, then collect a bunch of MP items to go boost their MP to allow them to turn into a witch, and then hopefully if you've done that all right, you get probably her best version throughout the whole series. And then you had to collect a absolute shitload of dragons back in PSP. This time around, you only need one of each kind, so it's a lot more forgiving, but it's a lot more expensive to go and recruit her, so there's that. I mean, comparatively more expensive. Technically, the numbers are the same, but anyway, it feels like it's more difficult to get her money-wise this time around. Still, though, recruiting her, you get the real, prize of actually going and, recruiting there, which is Pumpkinstopheles, the unique pumpkin head, who breaks the text limit. Obviously, that's the real reason we do that side quest. But anyway, so that will be about that then. I think this looks pretty darn good, in my opinion. I think this looks pretty darn accurate. This is looking a lot more right. Let's see if there's any adjustments that we'd make here, because... as far as the dominant tier ones, Lord, there's no question. Princess is just really solid. You've got the tanky options. You've got the great gear access. You've got great access in terms of spells and things. Great skills on there. Lucky Star and Princess's Whim are really strong this time around because they're autos. Basically, one crit card is all you ever need with a Princess on the team. The one thing that has been mentioned a couple of times is that it's a little bit weird that she doesn't get the ability to get Velocity Shift. Vale was mentioning that earlier, and it's like, yeah, that Velocity Shift would have made way more sense on her than the White Knights. Because basically the Princess back in their original version was a unit that would double up the actions of anybody in their squad. It was a March of the Black Queen thing. Dark Priest, yeah, guaranteed debuffs. Practically guaranteed. It's like 80%. And they're spamming it every round. All they have to do is sit still and stuff dies. That's just broken. Faerie's guaranteed mind control. You load them up with some tank equipment and just charge them forward. Or just give them the stinky set and watch them obliterate. No questions asked. Beast Tamer, not even a question. Patriarch has definitely earned their spot. Terror Knight, they still do great. The thing is, with their debuff, they can make anything work. I've seen them going and doing 800s with your basic Leech MP. Or, Leech Health, sorry. They're also in that category of just every type of card can benefit them. Their debuffs are insanely strong. They're just not something that draws aggro, so they're pretty much free to reposition as they will. So either way, can switch to offensive and defensive roles. Just never a bad idea to have one in the party. And they carry, aside from Fear, which affects everything but bosses, every other debuff that they have can affect everybody else. So yeah, that's perfectly fine. Liches are the only one that I would maybe move down, because but Liches are still crazy strong. And, Knight Commander's a bit boring, but, Again, Dominatrix joke, have to put it up there. Yeah, as far as if you're wondering why it's dominant tier, yeah, I've had Armored Core on the brain, don't judge me. Yeah, Valkyrie, no questions asked. Again, Conserve MP is just that busted. Dependable looks great to me. Adaptable, yeah, that looks about right. The Specialists, again, look about right. Fun to use, but not necessarily super overpowered is... yeah, that looks about right. The reason that Vartan gets to be there and not something a bit lower, since they do definitely fall off skills-wise, is just because of their ability to combine certain things at the right time, as well as high movement, and wide finisher access. So just bow and dagger does give them a lot of potential elemental punches. They can be exactly where you need them to be, and those instill buffs can be really handy for the harder hitters, especially dropping an instill next to a Dragoon could push them into actually fully one-shotting things at a base level. So either way, that's potentially handy there. Because again, it's 25%. If something is stabbing something for 2,000, that's an extra 500 damage that they're adding to that attack. Next up in terms of good to have, yeah, that looks about right. Yeah, that's the Ice Dragon. I always forget that the Ice Dragon looks different. Skeleton looks fine. Situational, difficult, liability. Yeah, that looks about right. And again, liability, because frankly, we all know Denev's going to turn on everybody at some point, and I'm pretty sure Warren might be senile. Does do some fantastic lore reports, though. That dude is awesome. Anyway, that'll be about that. Y'all have yourselves a good one. Feel free to roast me in the comments, as is the tradition at this point, and I'll see you next time. Take care.